Good evening and welcome to this evening's program, the second in our Marion200 speaker series to celebrate the bicentennial in Marion County. I'm Mark Holbrook, a member of the Bicentennial Steering Committee, and on behalf of the entire committee and our chairperson, Randy Winland, we thank you for coming this evening. Now, our topic tonight is a farmer's life. Now, imagine, if you will, the life of a farmer. Rising early before dawn, when most of the world is still asleep. It is so quiet you can almost hear the crops growing in the field. Now imagine that beautiful scene disturbed by the intrusive ringing of a cell phone. So, I see some of you reaching already. Now's the time to silence your cell phone, and we thank you for that. Marion County is celebrating the bicentennial of its founding with a year-long series of events and projects throughout 2020. The activities include events in the various villages in Marion City itself. A significant part of the overall celebration will be a series of 4 legacy projects designed to have an ongoing impact when the bicentennial projects are completed at the end of the year. Digitization Days will be an opportunity for Marion County residents to contribute through digital scanning of photographs, letters, diaries, and more to create a unique collection of community stories. Capture the Living Past will create a collection of recorded stories from people throughout the county to preserve for future generations to better understand Marion at the time of the bicentennial, right now. So we're working to record your stories for the bicentennial. The Marion200 speaker series, as we are tonight, will delve into topics such as agricultural, business, entertainment, religion, education, manufacturing, and much more during these public presentations throughout the year. And the Story of Us will be a compilation of all that goes on during the bicentennial year, creating a collection of video programs to be shared now and to be archived to ensure that future generations appreciate the history of our community. In addition to these projects, celebratory events will be taking place throughout the year. Homecoming events are planned in virtually every community in the county. Other events focusing on the bicentennial include the Huber Museum, Warren Harding Presidential Center dedication, the Marion Popcorn Festival, and much more. We invite you to pick up our brand new bicentennial events brochure that will keep you informed of everything going on. You should have got one when you came in. And of course, we're also this evening revealing our new Marion200 passport. So make sure you bring this back with you the next time and have that punched to prove that you were here. The year-long bicentennial celebration would not be possible without our generous legacy sponsors. When I turn this on, it actually works. There we go. Our thanks to the Marion County Commissioners, the Marion Community Foundation, the Marion Area Convention and Visitors Bureau, Marion Technical College, Merrill Lynch, the Olson Vincent Sharma Group, Ohio Health, Tri-Rivers Career Center, United Church Homes, and the Marion County Historical Society. Well, we are pleased and honored to welcome this evening's speaker, Mr. Mike Brewer, to talk about a subject integral to the story of the people of Marion County. Mike Brewer is a 9th-generation resident whose ancestors came to what is now Waldo Township in 1807. Mike is a 7th-generation member of the Marion County farming families. He grew up largely on the farm of his grandparents, Harry and Eloise Bibler, which is the farm he now owns. Mike attended school in both the Marion City and county school systems, and later received degrees from Fayetteville State University and Marion Technical College. He served his country for 7 years in the U.S. Army as an infantryman with the 4th Infantry and 82nd Airborne Divisions. Mike worked a variety of jobs through his career and retired as an owner-operator in the trucking industry. He has been actively involved with the Marion County Historical Society for several years and currently serves on its Board of Trustees. He is also a member of the steering committee of this bicentennial celebration. Mike's Marion County lineage includes the Brewer, Bibler, Schindler, Borg, Drake, Merchant, Lauer, Gayer, Benner, May, Morrill, Schweinfurth, Carhart, Mack, and Lapham families. Wow, Mike.
Did I write all that down?
You wrote all that down. He's the proud husband of Ruth Weinbaum, father of John and Daniel Brewer, and grandfather of Jack and Molly Brewer, who are here tonight. He and Ruth live in Richland Township. Mike will speak to us this evening about the history of agriculture in Marion and what it was and is like to lead a farmer's life. Let's welcome Mike.
Tonight's presentation, A Farmer's Life, will include discussion about the farmers and agricultural development of Marion County from its early times through today. Some background history of the establishment and settlement of the county, and a brief mention of its topography, farm life and its changes here over the years, farmers' lives, who they were, where they came from, what they found here and how they lived, and then my recollections and experiences of farm life. We'll begin by looking at the overall picture of the farming industry in Marion County today. I got this from Marion Made. I think it was correct as of last year. The land area contained within the county is about 265,000 acres. Of that, 200,000 acres are in farm production on 615 farms. The value of goods produced by Marion's very diverse agricultural industry is $135 million per year. Marion produces mostly corn, soybeans, and wheat, but also barley and oats. It also has orchards, vineyards, produce farms, apiaries, and a wide range of livestock operations. Nearly 1,000 people are directly employed in farming in the county. Marion companies are also involved in the production of ethanol and fertilizer. At least 30 Marion family farms have been operated by the same families for over 100 years, with at least 15 of those for over 150 years and one for about 190 years. Marion's beginnings as a county. This year, Marion County is 200 years old, but its beginnings came earlier in what are now Waldo and Prospect Townships south of the Greenville Treaty Line. I'll start the Marion County history discussion at that point in time. The first settlers arrived in what is now southern Waldo Township in 1806 and then in Prospect Township in 1814. They found the natural resources they needed, arable land, adequate water, and forests for fuel and shelter. Ohio became a state in 1803. By 1806, the area now containing Waldo Township below the Greenville Treaty Line had been surveyed and opened for government land sales. Land sales began there, and the first settlers, the Nathan Brundage and Nathaniel Wyatt families, arrived in 1806. Both families came from New York by way of Virginia and then Pickaway County, Ohio. And that was frequent in the early settlement. People came from other states, and then a lot of them would come to state or towns in Ohio and areas in Ohio that had already been settled. And then when the lands were opened up further north for sales, they'd come on up here. This is Ohio in about 1806. I'll find my laser pointer. Yeah, right there. And right in there is where the first settlers would have come. This is the Greenville Treaty Line. Everything north of the Greenville Treaty Line was Indian territory, except for some of these settlements that had been established by the terms of the Greenville Treaty in 1795. The settlers coming to this area purchased their tracts under the Land Act of 1804. According to that legislation, settlers could buy land in 160-acre minimums from the federal government for a minimum of $2 per acre. That was a lot of money for people coming in. So and the previous terms of land sales were even more severe. Before the 160-acre minimum was a 320-acre minimum, and before that was a 640-acre minimum. These purchases could be made with 1/4 of the total price down, and then 3 annual installments until the total due was paid. This was, as I said, this was a significantly smaller minimum acreage than previously allowed, making farmland available and affordable to more people. They made it more available and cheaper for people because the U.S. government needed money, and land sales were about their major way of raising funds. They didn't have income tax then like we have now. They didn't have a lot of other taxes like we have now. So their sale of western lands was going to be the main source of income for the government for quite a few years. Early settlers to the area had to bring nearly everything they would need by wagon to help furnish their cabins and provide for their everyday needs, including hand tools such as axes, hatchets, hammers, knives, files, spades, scythes, and saws, spinning wheels and looms for making linen and wool cloth and clothing, needles, ropes, iron, pots, skillets, and basic dishes and utensils, a long gun to provide meat and nuisance control. Critters would get into your fields and eat your stuff, and wolves would be howling outside at night, so they needed a rifle or a shotgun to protect themselves from it. The trip here, whether from points in Ohio or other states, was usually accomplished by horse and wagon. I've read accounts where the journey was accomplished averaging as few as 5 miles per day to over 20. Large rivers were crossed by ferry, and the ferries were established early on as the westward expansion took place, and then the smaller rivers were crossed by fording. Roads were often no more than trails widened by cutting trees, leaving stumps hopefully low enough to allow wagons to pass over. Still, wagons would often bottom out in the ruts that had been created by the previous wagons passing through, and to get stuck on the stumps, hence the expression being stumped. When they got hung up like that, they'd oftentimes have to unload the entire wagon, make it light enough to pull it across the stump, and then load everything back up again. Upon arrival, they would begin clearing land for their first crop at their new place. Smaller trees would be cut down and worked around, while the larger ones would be girdled, in which a ring of bark was removed in order to kill them. They might only be able to clear 5 acres or so their first year, and some similar acreage each subsequent year. The amount that they were able to clear would oftentimes be determined by the size of the family. If it was a guy and his wife and their 2 kids, they're not going to be clearing ground as rapidly as the guy and his wife and his 14 kids. And there were families that were pretty large. I'll talk about that here momentarily. They might plant corn, potatoes, beans, pumpkin, and other vegetables their first year. Potatoes and pumpkin were a very main staple early on. And they ate that and a lot of meat. And then in following years, they'd add wheat. Wheat apparently was not a good crop to grow a first year when they cleared ground. They'd also plant 1/4 to 1/2 acre of flax from which to make thread for linen. They had to make their own cloth. And in order to make their own cloth, they had to make their own thread. Squirrels, birds, and raccoons would often attack the corn crop. Later on, hunts were organized and carried out to eliminate these pests to the extent that entire supplies of shot and powder would be exhausted. In the account I read of this, they were talking about they'd go to Delaware to buy their stuff, or they'd go to Mansfield to buy their stuff a little bit later on, and those supplies would be sold out in Delaware and Mansfield as well. Deer, turkey, and squirrels were plentiful meat sources for the early arrivals. However, by 1860, the deer had been hunted to extinction in the Marion area. They wouldn't return in numbers until mid to late 19th century, or 20th century rather. It's difficult to imagine those harsh conditions. We can look at a night like tonight and think about being out there without our warm vehicle and our warm stuff and get just a little bit of idea how tough it was for them all the time. The work necessary to simply survive was indescribable. Planting, cultivating, pest control, and endless toil. Wood cutting, hauling, sawing, splitting, and stacking for the cold winter months, and year-round cooking fires would be ongoing. I'm not sure how much wood they needed for this area for a winter time, but I know further north up in Michigan, they planned on 15 cords of wood for every fireplace every winter. So 15 cords is a lot of wood, so they had to cut a lot. And if they didn't have it cut, they got cold. Building fences for livestock, securing and storing feed for winter, stump and root pulling, making, repairing, and maintaining clothing and equipment. At night, the only thing they had to work by was candlelight and fireplace. And then they had near constant, inescapable effects of climate year-round. Frostbite in the wintertime, heat stroke in the summertime, and then the constant threat of injury or worse. The kind of work that they were doing and the equipment that they had, they were subject to get hurt or killed just about any time. We've got a grave out on Cardington Road of a fellow named John Grimm who was killed out there around 1838 when a tree that he was working on fell on him and killed him. Another fellow named John Green up in the northern part of Marion County was moving a wagon full of rocks, and it got hung up, and he's down there trying to get it to move. It slipped and fell on him and killed him. Farming life in general has been always fraught with the risk of serious injury at just about any time. Little recreational or relaxation time, aside from religious services or occasional social gatherings. And then milk fever and malaria were common diseases, and there were others. Mortality rates from disease and injury were high. And aside from some wooden animal-drawn plows, most farming at this time was done with hand tools, much like it had been done for centuries. They built their cabins upon arrival, which would be 14 to 18 foot square, 6 to 7 feet from the ground to the eaves, with a fireplace and chimney along one wall. And if you had a family of 3, that was the size of the house you had. And if you had a family of 14, that was the size of the house you had. House raisings were usually accomplished in one day after the logs had been cut prior and then moved to the home site. And neighbors would share the work in the house raising effort. This log cabin is from Franklin County. This picture was taken in 1915, but this is one of the original cabins down there, and you can see that is small and it's pretty sparse. You've got your chimney over here. There wouldn't be any stone in that. That was all stick and log and mud, and then probably about 7 feet from there to there, you got a door. This one's got no windows. William Drake is my earliest known direct ancestor in what is now Marion County. He entered 160 acres in what is now southern Waldo Township in 1807, and then an additional 640 acres along the Greenville Treaty Line in 1813. He's a pretty interesting guy. He was born in 1769 around the area of Newburgh, New York, to immigrants from England from Liverpool, England, who had arrived in 1768. His father, John, went on to serve on the American side in the American Revolution a few years later. In 1807, he arrived in what is now Marion County with his son Uriah. He stayed long enough to clear some ground and get the crop planted, and then he went back to New York to get the rest of his family, leaving his 17-year-old son Uriah here for the time that he was gone and until he got back. He got back in 1808 with his wife and 7 other children. They'd go on to have 14 children total. Of those 14 children, only 5 survived past him. So infant mortality was high at that time. A lot of things happened, injury. A lot of women died in childbirth early on. There were a lot of things to kill you. Somewhere around 1810 or 1811, I'm not sure the exact date, the government decided that they needed a road to be built through what is now Marion County on up to the lake. They anticipated the war coming, and they wanted to be able to get up to their settlements and their forts up there. So Drake and about 6 other people were on a survey crew that surveyed what came to be known as the Harrison War Road in Marion, and just the War Road in general. There are actually two roads. One of them went through what's now Route 423, pretty much, and then the other one went along the Scioto River. His son Uriah was a postal carrier from Franklin County up to what is now Fremont, and he was also contracted to grow a corn crop up there for a fellow in Delaware. And on his way back, about 3 miles north of Tiffin, this would have been 1811. On his way back from Tiffin, he was attacked and murdered. 3 different stories: a renegade white guy named Spicer murdered him, a free black man named Jackson murdered him, or Indians murdered him. So we got 3 different stories depending upon the account which you read. But we do know that he was killed because his grave is still up in Fremont, just across from the library up there. So he was also, William Drake was also General Harrison's Indian agent in this area, and he was also the perpetrator of what was known variously as Drake's Folly, Drake's Defeat, whatever. He got that was a little bit of infamy for him. He raised a company of militiamen, and they were going to go up north to either Fort Ferry or Fort Stevenson, depending upon the account which you read. But their first night out, they're camped over near Owens Road in State Route 423. So he puts everybody to bed, and then he goes out in the woods a couple hours later, shoots off his gun, comes running back into camp screaming, "Indians, Indians." And he was hoping that they would form the way they had talked about prior, but what they did, a lot of them just panicked and ran. And it caused some pretty widespread panic all along the frontier in Norton. They were freaked out, and a lot of people running away, and a lot of mishap and bad things happening. Again, depending upon the account you read, either they reorganized and went on back up to Fort Ferry or Fort Stevenson where they were going, or they disbanded the company right there, and everybody went home hanging their head in shame. He went on to become an associate judge. He was a livestock dealer. He'd take livestock to and from Detroit, and he lived until 1851. Like I said, he had 14 children, and he survived all but 5 of them. My next ancestors new to the area were the Jacob Coldren family. They arrived sometime prior to 1817 down in what's now Waldo Township. Originally from Pennsylvania, they were in Washington County of the Northwest Territory in 1800, which I found in the census, and then in Fairfield County in 1810. James, their son, married Abigail Drake in 1817. James and Abigail spent their lives on their farm east of Norton. The Drakes and Coldrens were next door neighbors, and they, like many families at that time, often intermarried with neighboring families, sometimes over multiple generations. They didn't travel far, so they didn't meet too many people, so they married close to home. There's James and there's Abigail in their later years. And as you can see, they both lived some pretty hard lives. It was tough going back then, and if they did manage to live to an older age, they were usually pretty worn out. Okay, and this is that area again. There's the town of Norton, which is still there. There's the Greenville Treaty Line again. And then again, everything north. See how I did that? Everything north is Indian land. On April 1st, 1820, Marion, along with 13 other counties, was created by the Ohio legislature from lands recently acquired from Indian tribes. And we won't even go into that. Land sales would open that year. The previous year, a complete survey had been made of the county in preparation of land sales. Those sales would take place in accordance with the Land Act of 1820. James Worthington, Ohio's former governor, was a deputy surveyor, as was Alexander Holmes, who went on to fame as being one of the founders of the city of Marion with Eber Baker. And again, William Drake was a crew member on one of those survey crews. At that time, about 1/3 of the county was covered by the Sandusky Plains, with the other 2/3 in forest. Indian and animal trails were found to lace the county during the survey. Many would be widened to create roads later on. The Sandusky Plains were an area of about 185,000 acres of predominantly grassland in the northern half of Marion County when it was surveyed in 1819. It had been known to Europeans since their entry into the area in the mid-1600s. And the plains were undoubtedly the result of efforts by ancient inhabitants. Who or for how long, it's uncertain. But we know that they used it, they did regular burnings there to keep the vegetation down and to keep everything fresh, and they do hunting, and what other purposes they had, we're not really sure of. That area would not be heavily farmed or settled until the 1830s and after. And Kensel Clutter has written 2 comprehensive books about the Sandusky Plains, and working with Willis Thomas, a complete map of it was compiled. And those books and maps are available at the Marion County Historical Society. The one book is about 140 pages long, and it contains a lot of information and a lot of photographs of the Sandusky Plains. So this is Marion County in 1820. As you can see, the southern border is the Greenville Treaty Line. Yeah. And it's bordered by Richland County and Crawford County and even Knox County over here. Wyandotte County and Morrow County would not come into existence until a couple decades later. As you can see, there's our roads going through. There's the War Road going up north, and then there are other interconnecting roads all around. The national picture in 1820. High birth rates among Americans caused the population increase from slightly under 4 million to over 9.6 million people between 1790 and 1820. And this population growth was due almost exclusively to high birth rates. Our immigration rates from Europe at that time were still very low. So William Drake and his 14 children were not anomalies at that time. Big families were common. Immigration from other countries wouldn't become a major factor in population growth until after 1830, when the U.S. population had reached nearly 13 million. So in that short period of time there, the population doubles and then doubles again. This immigration factor generally held true in Marion County as well. Our first people here in 1820 were mostly Americans. There were very few immigrants from Europe coming in at that time. Also at that time, over 90% of the entire population was considered rural. In other words, farming related. At the time of Marion County's establishment, it had about 4,000 of these 80-acre tracts that were available for purchase. Marion County's population for the first 10 years of its existence would increase to 6,550 people. That worked out to new families, mostly farmers, arriving each week during that period. Many of the arrivals came from New York, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, often by way of Ohio counties further south and southeast. And then most others came from mostly northeastern states. We didn't have any, the Carolinas, Georgia, there wasn't much, if any, immigration from down there up to here. Settlers who had arrived earlier south along the Greenville Treaty Line, the ones we talked about earlier, they were there to assist those new arrivals, showing them around and helping them to get started. If the new arrivals wanted to, there were people down there that would contract to build their cabins for them. They'd bring them up and show them where all the different tracks were at to help them choose from it, because they'd been down there for a few years and they pretty well knew their way around. The first land purchaser in Marion County was G.H. Griswold, who had passed through on the Scioto Military Road as a teamster during the War of 1812. And there were a lot of veterans of the War of 1812 who came through Marion and saw it for the first time, like thousands of them. And there were a fair number of them that came back and settled here later on. The earliest resident of Marion County appears to have been Ebenezer Roseberry, who ran a trading post up in Grand Prairie Township near the War Road beginning sometime around 1812. The first side of my Brewer side ancestors began arriving around 1826. Drake was a Bibbler, which is the other side of my dad's family. And then the Brewers started getting here in 1826 or so. They included Christian Gruber, who was my fifth great-grandfather, who entered 160 acres on what became known as the Infirmary Farm in the area of today's Walmart in January of 1827. A month later, at age 38, he died, leaving his widow with 4 children. Like I said, life was hard, and it sometimes ended pretty quickly here. There was a lot of disease, malaria being a big one, and then, like I mentioned earlier, milk sickness. They didn't know what caused it, and a lot of people came down ill and passed away. He came from Virginia, and then after he died, his father-in-law, Jacob Mauser, my 6th great-grandfather, joined his widowed daughter shortly before his death a few years later. And I mention him because he's my oldest ancestor buried in Marion County. He's buried over at Marion Cemetery. Another of my early Marion ancestors was Arthur Lapham, who arrived with his wife in 1826 to Salt Rock Township. And several of his siblings also came along and bought tracts in that area. Starting out with 80 acres in a log cabin, by 1837, his acreage and prosperity apparently had increased significantly enough to allow for the construction of his spacious brick home, known for many years as the Lapham Brick, which is there. It's still standing. I took that photograph probably 10 years ago, and it's fallen into more disrepair since then. Arthur, after his daughter married my first Brewer ancestor in Marion County, left for the goldfields of California the day after the wedding in 1849 with his oldest son Amos and 5 other guys. They went out to California to seek gold. He got out there okay, but after he got there, he and 2 companions drowned crossing the river. He's kind of unique in that he was born in Rhode Island. Then his family migrated. He was born in 1802. His family migrated to Champaign County in 1815. And then he came to Marion County when he came and stayed until he left, and he made it all the way to the Pacific coast where he died. You know, a fellow born in 1802 made it from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Also arriving during this decade were all those people that Mark read. My May, Bibbler, Height, Mauser, and Merchant ancestors. Henry and Sarah May opened an inn up in Brush Ridge. They came from Pennsylvania by way of Franklin County, while the Bibblers, Heights, and Merchants they all came from Virginia. They settled in Grand Prairie or Marion Townships, and again, most of them had been elsewhere between the time they left Virginia and the time they got here. John Merchant went down to New Orleans and made his way back up here, and then the Bibblers and Heights were down in Fairfield County before they came here. I mentioned the early families using spinning wheels for making yarn and linen thread. This photo of my great-great-grandmother, Sarah Bibbler, was taken around 1890. Sarah was born to William and 19-year-old Sarah May Morrill. You may have heard that name if you're from Marion County. Her mother died at childbirth, age 19, and so she was raised by her grandmother. And there she is. This is probably 1890, somewhere in there when this picture was taken. And she's still got the spinning wheel. It's got yarn hanging off of it. One would assume that they were still spinning yarn even at that time. While other factors figure in, this move from the farm can be attributed in part to decreasing need for manpower for farming operations, including the development of practical, affordable, and a commercially successful steel plow by John Deere in 1837. This plow allowed for the opening of previously unfarmable plains and grasslands. There's a modern-day picture of an antique John Deere plow. And there are 2 plows in use. And this photograph was taken near LaRue, I found out later. And that's the old LaRue School. in this area where these guys are plowing is currently Section Street. I'm not sure when that photograph was taken, probably around 1900. And here are mules on the Klein farm in Marion. I included that because it's a cool picture. He's pulling a cultivator through a cornfield with mules. Another innovation which eliminated the centuries-old method of harvesting grain by hand with scythes and sickles was the mechanical reaper, introduced in 1831. It wasn't widely accepted or utilized until 1847 after it had been improved, at which time it would meet with widespread success and popularity. The first reaper in Marion County was reported around 1848. This is the 1831 model. It's an engraving that I found. As you can see, the guy sitting on the horse has a pretty easy job. The guy back here with the rake, their cutting blades are going across as the horse pulls it along the rows. And these cutting blades down here are cutting it. It falls back onto this platform back here, and this guy with the rake rakes it off. There are going to be 3 or 4 guys back here whose job it is to bundle it up. And they're the ones, their job didn't get any easier with the reaper. They're working pretty hard. And there's the 1847 model. Got 2 horses pulling it. The guy with the rake now gets to stand right there on it. He doesn't have to walk along. The 1830s also began the period of large waves of immigrants from Europe, both nationally and in Marion County. My immigrant ancestors came from Germany beginning around this time and became farmers in Richland, Prospect, and Pleasant Township. They included the Mack, Boehner, Schweinfurth, Berger, Lauer, and Geyer families. These families would marry into others. If your family is of German descent during that time period, you and I are quite possibly cousins. The period from 1840 to 1860 was one of great changes in Marion. Big one came when the railroads came. But between 1845 and 1848, the county lost about 20% of its area to the formation of Wyandotte and Morrow counties. In exchange, it acquired a small part of Waldo and Prospect townships below the old Greenville Treaty Line. Hence a very small population gain that decade. There was about a 4% population gain, but that was due entirely to the loss of area and the population of these other counties being established. Then around 1849, the first of several railroads arrived, which changed the economy immediately and tremendously. Prior to that, everything that came in or came out was either carried on a wagon or carried on a pack animal or carried on somebody's back. After the railroads came, incoming goods, which had previously been expensive, became much more affordable. Farm ground prices changed quite a bit. They went from $40 or $8 per acre to $40 just about overnight. Items produced here became much more valuable. The price of a horse went from $60 to $150, and then farm commodities increased in similar proportions. Imported goods, iron, cotton, salt, sugar, all experienced significant price drops. This newfound prosperity led to the construction of public roads, bridges, and expensive public buildings. So here's Marion County after the new counties were founded. Wyandotte County was cut out from the north. Marion lost about 2 miles all along its top edge when Wyandotte County was established. And then when Morrow County was established, it lost 4 townships over there. The 1860s would be marked by the Civil War. Most of Marion County's military-aged men, nearly 2,000, would serve during this conflict. And this is from a population of about 15,000 people total in the entire county. So Marion was heavily invested in the war with its manpower. Noteworthy that Marion County's population would only increase about 4% that decade, the only decade that did not experience double-digit percentage growth until 1930. And in the war notwithstanding, developments in agriculture would continue. This is my 3rd great uncle, Valentine Lapham. He was Arthur Lapham's son. The reason I include this is because I only have 2 photographs of my relatives who served in the Civil War, and Valentine was one of them. He served in the Company E of the 96th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, which was a company that was made up completely of Marion men. He rose to the rank of captain before he was discharged. He was wounded in battle in Louisiana, came home to recuperate, went back and joined the war, and then he was finally discharged in 1864. He came back to Marion after the war, promptly got married, had a variety of jobs. He was a postmaster for a while. He sold jewelry for a while. He was and watches. He was a town marshal. And finally, he took his family and went to Chicago, where he spent the remainder of his life earning a pretty good living as an inventor. Apparently, he was a very inventive guy. He held quite a few patents, and he died in 1928. Edward Huber, who would become Marion's leading industrialist and business leader, came to Marion in 1865 to manufacture his Huber revolving rake. It was a significant advancement in affordable, work-saving farm implements. Later, the Huber Manufacturing Company would be organized and would develop and market the Huber line of agricultural implements, threshing machines, steam tractors, and gasoline-powered tractors. He also had a line of other equipment, but I didn't go into that because it wasn't agriculture related. We have a Huber display over here that I would encourage you all to go over and visit after the presentation tonight. All these innovations and inventions would serve to increase farming efficiency and decrease the need for manpower. There's a trend there throughout every decade. Efficiency increases and the need for manpower decreases. Here's a piece of a Huber tractor and a Huber combine dated 1828 or 1928. I'm not sure where that's at. That's just to give you an example of what Huber equipment looked like. Then in 1867, Jacob Hauser and others doing business as the Marion Importing Company began importing and breeding Norman draft horses. In 1869, he imported Prince Imperial, which eventually would be mounted by a taxidermist and is now on display at the Marion County Historical Society. But if you want to see him, go up to the museum. He's right there. The Marion Importing Company would continue importing Normans through 1883. They imported them, they bred them, they let them out for stud service, and they developed quite a line of workhorses. Then Mr. Hauser also kept Spanish Merino sheep, Durham cattle, and Poland China hogs. Over the next several decades, improvements in farming equipment and methods would continue, again, increasing productivity and reducing the man hours. Tilling and drainage of low-lying ground would begin around here in earnest in the 1880s. Then the use of commercial fertilizer would become significant in the 1890s, increasing yields and profitability. And that industry increases through today. Power equipment would be developed working alongside and then gradually replacing draft horses, again reducing labor and increasing productivity. In 1869, my great-great-grandfather, Mike Brewer, moved his family from their farm near Carpenter's Corners in Salt Rock Township to the farm known as the Vincent Pettit Farm in Grand Prairie Township. That old homestead and the adjacent farm ground are still in possession of Brewer family members. The house in the following view burned down in 1938 and was replaced by the current dwelling, and the original 1862 barn still stands. I didn't talk about Emery earlier. He was kind of a mystery to the family. We knew he came from New York, but we didn't know anything other than that about him, other than what was recorded in the family history. He came to Marion about 1843, went to work for a fellow named Thomas Dye for about a year, and received his compensation for working a horse, a bridle, a saddle, and during that time he also accumulated 2 other horses. He took the horses back to his hometown in New York, sold them, walked back to Marion again, repeated the process, took 6 horses back to New York and sold them, walked back to Marion one more time to where he stayed. He was married to his former employer's daughter in 1849. I mentioned Arthur Lapham earlier. Uncle Roy, this picture was taken about 1900, I think. That's Uncle Roy and Aunt Gertrude, Grandpa Ed and Grandma Lida, Carhart Brewer. My great-grandfather, Ellery Brewer, and Uncle Herbert Brewer. And I knew Herbert, and I knew Ellery, and I knew Gertrude. And these are people who were born in 1900, so I was pretty lucky in that regard. This is a place to shift over to the evolution of our family farm, similar to many farms and farm transitions in Marion County over the generations. Some farms got bigger, some farms got smaller, just depending. When Emery died in 1880 at the age of 60, after several years of bad health, he'd also made some speculation during the Civil War that didn't work out for him. So the family story goes, and had some financial problems. So his holdings at that time were about 1,500 acres, which wasn't a small spread for the time. He left his wife and 2 children, 18-year-old Ed and 13-year-old Cora. About 500 acres of that 1,500-acre farm were sold to settle the debts of his estate. Eventually, half the remaining acreage was inherited by each child. Cora's farm was all near Carpenter's Corners, and Ed's was in Grand Prairie and at Carpenter's Corners. The big family farm had become 2 smaller family farms. Ed ran his farm through his children until his death in 1940. During his life, he was the first of my Brewer line to see the transition from electricity and farms in the county and the shift from the horse-driven agricultural life to powered tractors and implements. He left 4 heirs among whom his estate was divided, so each received about 125 acres. He also lived to see the end of the Great Depression. And now we'll look at the Depression here for a minute from a Marion County perspective. The market crashed in 1929, and so did farm prices. As banks scrambled to stay afloat, they called in farm loans which could not be paid. Banks and creditors foreclosed on failing farms, with many banks also failing. Throughout the 1930s, conditions worsened before they improved. The Brewer family, according to my grandfather Harry, did okay and weathered things well. Many others, however, not so much. Sheriff sales of farms would be regular occurrences through the 1930s. In 1939, Harry would purchase one of those farms, which consisted of 85 acres, 2 houses, and a barn for $4,800. And that, even in 1939 dollars, is a pretty good price for a farm. The war in Europe had driven crop prices up. For many, there was a bumper crop in 1940. That light at the end of the tunnel was being reached by the surviving farmers of the Depression. Harry was able to pay that farm he bought for less than $5,000 off in 1 year. 1941 was also a good year for farmers. Things were looking bright as they prepped the ground that fall in anticipation of the spring planting, but then boom. December 7th, 1941, the nation is in World War II. And on March 1st, 1942, as the government is gearing up war production as quickly as they can, landowners of 12,500 acres of farm ground in Marion County were notified by the United States government that they were being evicted to facilitate the construction of the Scioto Ordnance Plant. 125 families who had just weathered 10 miserable years of the Depression were now having their livelihoods removed. While they would receive just compensation for their land, they would have to dispose of livestock, machinery, and other assets at what were bargain basement prices. They were given 60 days to vacate their homes and farms. Their moving costs were not compensated. And the farms and homes were vacated, the facility built and put into operation. It operated for about 3 years, employing at its peak about 2,900 people. Many of them had moved from southern Ohio and Kentucky for the high-paying jobs. 3 years later, those jobs were gone. Eventually, some of the owners would return to the farms they had owned previously, but not many. The land, now surplus, would eventually be disposed of. Some was sold, some was obtained by the state, and some by the city of Marion, where the current site of the airport's at. And Charles and Delpha Mosher wrote a comprehensive history of the Scioto Ordnance Plant and the Marion Engineer Depot, which are also available online and at the Marion County Historical Society. Back on the Brewer farm, Ed Brewer had passed in 1940. His wife Ida passed 4 years later in 1944. The farm would be divided among their 4 children. The family farm was once again farms, much smaller than before. Brothers Herbert and Roy both had children to whom their farms passed upon their deaths, again divided into smaller farms. The process would be repeated for the next generations. Ed's 3rd son, Ellery, died in 1959, leaving his farm to his wife. When she died in 1971, it passed to their only son, Harry. Harry had been farming Ellery's farm along with his own since the late 1930s. His son, Max, born in 1938, would work for him from the 1950s until Harry died in 1997. The farm had never provided enough income for 2 families, so Max always worked full-time jobs, usually 3rd shift, in addition to his farm work. Harry's wife, Eloise, worked as a school teacher during their entire marriage, and she died in 1973, less than a year after she retired from teaching. Their son, Max, farmed for 2 years after Harry passed and realized that farming on such a small scale was no longer tenable. He sold the machinery and began cash renting the farm ground in the year 2000. And he died two years later. Today, 3 small farms that were part of the original Emery Brewer farm are still owned by his descendants. One still farms the ground, while the other 2 rent theirs to other farming operations. I spent lots of time on the Harry Brewer farm growing up, and although I helped seasonally on an as-needed basis, there was never enough farm there to provide livelihoods for father and son, let alone father, son, and grandson. So I would go on to other endeavors, returning to farm work from time to time over the years as needed. My father, Max, was the last generation to farm full-time on our part of the family farm. My cousin Ed is the only brewer left farming on that original ground. Now I've included some pictures here towards the end of the presentation. This is John Carey in Marion County raising on his ginseng patch around 1920. His nephew Richard Carey over there thinks. I didn't realize that ginseng was a crop here in Marion County until I saw that. Here are horses from the Scioto Stock Farm over by LaRue. The Scioto Stock Farm was begun by a fellow Andrew Jackson Jones in around 1830, and I've been told that it's still in operation by the same family. Here's a Huber tractor at work on the Great Plains. Just put that in there to show you a Huber tractor at work. This would be one of the first tractors I remember from my childhood on the farm, an ACWD 45. And here's the other first tractor I remember from the farm, a John Deere model. Here's today's John Deere tractor. One of them. Things have changed a bit. Those were probably 30, 35, 38 horsepower tractors I showed you earlier. This one is probably somewhere north of 400 horsepower. And there's another modern John Deere tractor with more conventional tires on it. Here's a threshing operation. We put that one in there because it captures all 3 elements of farming. We've got the tractor driving the thresher, putting the grain into the truck with horses right there doing whatever part of the operation they were doing. Here's another picture of the Scioto Stock Farm. That picture is courtesy of Richard Carey. There's a corn crib like I remember when I was a kid. We'd put the eared corn in through the elevator there, and it would dry like that. There's another barn with horses. And this is a modern drying operation storage. You saw that old wire corn crib just a minute ago. This is what today's operation looks like. There's a grain drill at work. McCormick. I'm not sure when, probably 1920s. This is the first corn picker I remember. That's not the one, but it's just like it. That was a two-row corn picker. It took about a day to put it onto the tractor. And it picked 2 rows at a time. There's a corn head today. That's a 16-row corn head. There's a first type of combine I remember being on, and as you can see, the operator he stands right up there. He's standing out there in the wide open or sitting. He's probably standing looking down, and all that crap and crud and dirt and everything is blowing up in him, all over him, chaff. I was about probably 5 years old, and I had to ride the combine a couple days with Granddad. And I think that was probably about the first time I started realizing that farming might not be in my genes, because that was about as miserable as I've ever been. There's a modern combine. There's a modern grain head. I'm not sure if that's a 40 or a 45 footer, but they've gotten a lot bigger, to say the least. I remember talking to my dad back in the 80s. I think we were up to 26-foot grain heads then, and he didn't see how they could possibly get any bigger. But they did. And there's a farm wagon like the one I was riding in when Granddad was picking corn with that corn picker I just showed you. As he goes down the row, I'm dodging corn cobs flying back, again 4 or 5 years old. They're flying back hitting me, and then when he made the turn on the end of the row, I couldn't dodge them. They were hitting me. There's a modern grain wagon. There's my granddad, Harry Brewer. That was about the year he died. That's his dog, Mitzi. There's my grandma, Eloise Brewer. She 1911 and 1973. And there's my dad, Max Brewer. He was the last brewer to farm our part of the Brewer family farm. Thanks for coming out tonight. 2 topics I avoided were those of religion and education as it applies to Marion County farming, because we have presentations coming up on those subjects as part of the bicentennial celebration. The Marion County Historical Society has many publications by local historians on a wide variety of subjects, including the 1907 history of Marion County, which is good source material for any kind of history research you want to do locally. Come up to Heritage Hall Gift Shop and check them out. The 1883 history of Marion County is a great resource book for local history as well, and it's available online. And thank you. Okay.
Well, thank you, Mike. We appreciate that look back into a farmer's life going back from, gosh, the very, very beginning. Pretty amazing. Well, we would also like to do something tonight for the very first time. Wilson Bohannon is Marion's oldest business in continuous operation, celebrating their 160th year in operations. They began in Brooklyn, New York in 1860 and moved to Marion in 1927. We are pleased to announce that courtesy of the Wilson Bohannon Law Company and the Howard Smith family, each of our speakers will receive a bicentennial commemorative padlock personalized with their name and date. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Mike will be available for questions over here off to the side after the presentation. We're also pleased to announce that Wilson Bohannon will also be producing bicentennial raffle offers of fundraising for the bicentennial programming efforts, with numbers 2 to 50 being available for purchase. We'll have more information on that, on the when and wheres of all that very, very soon. Please feel free to stay in the auditorium and visit our many exhibitors. We would like to thank those exhibitors. Our thanks to the Tri-Rivers Career Center for being our host this evening. We hope you will join us at our next Marion200 Speakers Series event on March 12th. And the topic will be reading, writing, and arithmetic. Good night, and thank you.